You have exactly 5 minutes to sign over Sterling Heights Eleanor, or I make the call to have you involuntarily committed for a complete psychological collapse. My father, Arthur Sterling, didn't even flinch as he stared at me across the massive mahogany dining table, his voice as cold as the ice cubes, rattling in his glass of expensive scotch. He was threatening to lock me away in a high-security psychiatric ward just so he could steal the $580 million company I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears over the last 5 years. He sat there looking smug, wrapped in a $3,000 suit, believing he was holding a loaded gun to my head. He didn't realize that I was the one who had already dismantled the firing pin and emptied the magazine. I waited for him to take a slow, arrogant sip of his 30-year-old Highland Park scotch, and then I set my silver fork down with a sharp, echoing clink against the fine white china. "You are mistaken, Dad. I didn't come here to negotiate my surrender or to beg for your mercy. I came here to perform a clinical autopsy on your legacy and to watch you realize that your reign is over." I reached under my heavy velvet chair, pulled out the thick, leather-bound legal binder I had been concealing, and slammed it onto the table directly between us with a thud that made the crystal wine glasses dance. Before I tell you how I turned his own trap against him and reclaim my life, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice and redemption. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. What city or state are you watching this from today? 4 hours earlier, the only thing on my mind was the glowing green ticker running across the bottom of the television screen in my corner office. Sterling Heights Hospitality Group was officially valued at $580 million. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago headquarters, looking down at the rainy streets of the city that finally knew my name for my own achievements, not for my father's reputation. I am 24 years old, and I spent every waking second of the last 5 years clawing my way up from the bottom to build this view. My hands were still calloused from the early days of manual labor, a physical reminder of the distance I had traveled. Then my phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was not a congratulatory call from a business partner or a friend. It was a text from Arthur Sterling. "Family dinner, 7 o'clock sharp, urgent. Do not be late. There was no hello. No, I am proud of you for the valuation." Just a cold command, as if I were still the scared 19-year-old girl he had thrown out of the house for loving a man he couldn't control. My stomach tightened into a knot, a phantom reflex from a time when his disapproval could physically crush my spirit. 5 years ago, Arthur had locked the iron gates of our family estate in my face during a winter storm. He called my husband Julian a parasitic draftsman and told me that if I married a penniless architect with no family name, I was dead to the Sterling legacy. He didn't just disinherit me, he tried to erase me. He cut off my access to the family trust, blocked my credit cards, and even canceled my health insurance while I was recovering from a severe flu. He wanted us to starve in the cold so I would come crawling back on my knees begging for his forgiveness and his money. He did not know that hunger is a powerful motivator for someone with a sterling heart. Julian and I lived on instant noodles and tap water for 2 years in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in Pilsen that smelled like damp plaster and old wood. We slept on a thin mattress on the floor while we spent our days renovating our first boutique hotel with our own bare hands painting walls until our fingers bled. Arthur thought he was breaking my spirit. He was actually forging me into a weapon that he could never hope to control. I picked up the phone in my office, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to ignore him forever. Why go back to that house? I didn't need his approval anymore. I certainly didn't need his urgent drama. But then I remembered the notification I had received an hour earlier from my encrypted messaging app. I opened the secure chat with Leo, my younger brother. Leo was the only one still trapped in that mansion, playing the role of the obedient son, while secretly feeding me intelligence on our father's failing business ventures. 2 days ago, Leo had sent me a grainy photo of a crumpled document he had fished out of the trash can in Arthur's private library. It was a final notice of default from a private equity firm that specialized in high-risk bridge loans. These people were essentially legalized loan sharks for the desperate elite. I zoomed in on the numbers and felt my heart skip a beat. The debt wasn't just a simple business loan. It was $30 million in toxic debt, personally guaranteed by Arthur, and it was due in full within 48 hours. The realization hit me like a shot of pure adrenaline. My father wasn't calling me for a family reunion or a long overdue apology. He was calling because he was drowning in his own bad decisions, and he had seen my company's valuation on the evening news. He saw me as a billionaire life raft. He thought he was inviting his little girl to dinner so he could bully her into a multi-million-dollar bailout to save his own skin. He didn't realize who was actually coming to the table. I didn't call Julian to talk about it. I didn't call a therapist to deal with the anxiety. I called my lead counsel and gave him a single clear instruction. Buy it, I told him. Buy the debt shell company that is holding Arthur's note. Pay whatever premium they ask for. I want that paper in my name before the sun sets tonight. When I walked out of my office and into the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished chrome doors. The scared, shaking girl who used to apologize for her own existence was gone. Tonight I wasn't going home to visit my father. I was going to visit my debtor. The dining room of the Sterling estate felt less like a place for a family meal and more like a cold, hollow crypt where affection had gone to die a long time ago. My mother Constance sat to my right, obsessively twisting her silk napkin until her knuckles were ghostly white. She would not meet my eyes. She had spent 30 years being the silent shadow of a tyrant, and she didn't know how to be anything else. Leo sat opposite her, staring intently at the floral pattern on the fine china, his jaw set in a hard line. His silence was a clear signal that the storm was already inside the house. Arthur sat at the head of the long table like a king on a crumbling throne, refusing to acknowledge the decay around him. He didn't offer a greeting or ask how I had managed to build a $500 million empire in 5 years. He just reached for the crystal decanter and poured himself another glass of scotch. As the amber liquid flowed, I saw it. A microscopic tremor in his hand. The crystal rim rattled against the decanter with a tiny metallic sound. He set the bottle down much too hard on the wood to mask the shaking. He wasn't calm. He was absolutely terrified. I saw the news today, he said, slicing into his medium rare steak with unnecessary violent force. Beginner's luck is a very dangerous drug, Eleanor. It makes amateur girls think they are actually seasoned businesswomen. He took a long, slow sip of his drink, his eyes drilling into mine with a look of pure condescension. And how is that draftsman of yours? Is he still playing with his crayons in that little studio while you do all the heavy lifting? He meant Julian. He always referred to my husband as the draftsman, spitting the word like it was a disgusting slur, refusing to acknowledge him as a brilliant, licensed architect, or as the man who had supported me when I had nothing. 5 years ago, those words would have made me shrink into my chair and hide my face. I would have stammered a defense of our marriage or tried to beg for a scrap of his respect. Tonight I just sat there and watched him. I watched the beads of sweat forming on his upper lip despite the cold air in the room. I watched the way his eyes darted involuntarily to the grandfather clock in the hallway, measuring every second he had left before his world collapsed. He wasn't a king holding court. He was a cornered animal baring its teeth because it had no other weapons left. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold clinical detachment of a surgeon looking at a malignant tumor. I was just waiting for the right moment to make the first cut. "We need to protect the family assets, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that feigned fatherly concern. "I have been speaking with some high-level specialists. It is clear that you are under a tremendous amount of professional strain. It is making you erratic, highly unstable." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and slid a thick manila envelope across the table. It stopped just inches from my plate, resting on the white linen like a death warrant. I opened the folder slowly. The top document was a drafted petition for emergency conservatorship. Beneath it were 3 separate psychiatric evaluations detailing my supposed severe nervous breakdown, my alleged paranoia, and my total inability to manage complex financial matters. All of them were signed, sealed, and ready to be filed with the probate court the very second I refused to cooperate with him. I glanced at the signature on the top evaluation. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a man I hadn't seen since I was 12 years old. Marcus Thorne signed this, I asked, keeping my voice as flat and steady as a frozen lake. He hasn't treated me or even spoken to me in over a decade. He would lose his medical license for perjury before the ink even dried on this page if a judge saw this. Arthur smiled then. It was a cruel, thin stretching of his lips that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. Thorne isn't worried about his medical license, Eleanor. He is much more worried about the $200,000 in illegal gambling debts I covered for him at an offshore casino last winter. He writes exactly what I tell him to write when I tell him to write it. He is a tool just like everyone else. The realization hit me with the heavy weight of a stone. He wasn't just a bully or a bad father. He was a puppet master who collected people's sins and used them as leashes to keep them in line. He truly believed he could lock me away in a mental facility and steal my entire life's work just because he held a marker on a degenerate doctor. He thought this was his ultimate checkmate. He leaned forward, the suffocating smell of expensive scotch and unearned arrogance rolling off him in waves. You sign the transfer of control to me voluntarily tonight, or Dr. Thorne files these papers. First thing in the morning. Your company stock will tank. Your investors will flee in a massive panic, and I will take over the board anyway to save the firm from your collapse. It is your choice, daughter. Be smart for once in your life. I looked down at the manila envelope, then back up at him. He looked triumphant, like a man who had just played an unbeatable ace in a high-stakes poker game. He expected me to crumble into tears. He expected the old Eleanor to beg him not to ruin her reputation and her life. But I just had one question left to ask. One final loose thread I needed to cut before I tightened the noose around his neck. Why, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I'm not asking about the business or the stolen money. Why did you target Julian 5 years ago? He is a brilliant man. He treats me with nothing but love and respect. Why did you hate him enough to try to starve us to death in that basement? Arthur chuckled, and the sound was wet, low, and incredibly ugly. He took another sip of his scotch, appearing relaxed now that he thought he had won the war. Hate him, I don't hate him, Eleanor. I don't think about him at all. He was just a necessary casualty in your education. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands wide as if explaining a simple math problem. You needed to learn the hard way that you couldn't survive a single week in this world without my name and my protection. So I made a few strategic phone calls. Chicago is a very small town for people with my level of influence. I told the partners at the top 5 architecture firms in the city that if they hired your husband, Sterling Financial would pull every single construction loan we held with them. He smiled, remembering the cruelty as if it were a fond family memory from a vacation. I heard you two were living in a basement for a while, eating canned soup and wearing coats inside to stay warm. I admit I checked your credit reports occasionally just to see how close you were to finally breaking. I wasn't being cruel, sweetheart. I was being a father. I had to let you hit rock bottom so you would remember who holds the ladder. The last microscopic grain of guilt I had been carrying in my heart for what I was about to do evaporated into the cold, stagnant air of that dining room. It disappeared as if it had never existed at all, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard resolve. I looked at the man across from me, the man who shared my DNA, the man who had tucked me into bed and read me stories as a child, and I realized that he was a stranger. No, he was worse than a stranger. He was a parasite that had fed on the dreams and the suffering of the people he was supposed to protect. Every night I had cried myself to sleep in that damp Pilsen apartment, worrying if we could pay the rent on time or if our electricity would be shut off. Every morning, Julian had walked out the door with a forced, brave smile, only to return defeated after another mysterious last-minute rejection from a firm that had been desperate to hire him an hour before. Every skipped meal, every shivering night under a single thin blanket, every ounce of self-doubt that had nearly drowned us. Arthur had orchestrated all of it from this very chair, swirling his expensive scotch and checking his credit reports like a god playing with ants. He viewed our poverty and our pain as a mere parenting strategy, a tool to break my will and force me back into his shadow. I reached out and slowly, deliberately slid the manila envelope with the fake psychiatric evaluations back across the table. I watched it glide over the white linen until it hit the base of his wine glass with a sharp, crystalline tink. "You talk a lot about leverage, Dad," I said, my voice hardening into a cold, polished steel that made my mother gasp softly. "You have spent your entire life believing that everyone has a price, and everyone has a point where they will break. So let us talk about your leverage, and more importantly, let us talk about mine." Arthur's smug smile faltered for the first time. The arrogance didn't leave his eyes, but it was joined by a flick of confusion. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" He snapped, his voice losing its smooth, predatory edge. "You aren't in a position to negotiate. You sign those papers tonight, or Dr. Thorne files the petition at the courthouse at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. There is no other path for you." I ignored his threat as if it were nothing more than a fly buzzing in the room. "Dr. Thorne can file whatever he wants," I replied, leaning forward until I could see the broken capillaries in his nose and the yellow tint in the whites of his eyes. "He can file 1,000 papers, but it won't matter, because by the time the sun comes up, you won't be the CEO of anything. You aren't negotiating with your daughter anymore, Arthur. You aren't even negotiating with a business rival." I opened the heavy, leather-bound legal binder I had placed on the table. Inside, there was no merger agreement or surrender document. It was a thick stack of transfer papers, each one stamped with the official blue seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the state of Illinois. I turned the binder around so he could read the bold text on the cover page. I saw the moment the blood drained from his face. It was a slow, terrifying wave that left his skin looking like wet ash. "You took out a $30 million bridge loan 6 months ago from a private equity firm called Cerberus Capital," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. "High interest, short-term, backed by your personal guarantee and secured by 51% of your voting shares in Sterling Financial. You were desperate because your tech acquisition in San Francisco had turned into a black hole that swallowed $20 million in a single quarter." Arthur's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. "That information is highly confidential." He finally rasped, his voice trembling. "How do you know about that loan? That was a private placement through a shell company. Nobody knew about that." I interrupted him with a cold, dry laugh. "Cerberus Capital was indeed a shell company," I said. "They specialize in buying up toxic debt from legacy firms that are too proud to admit they are failing. And they were looking to offload their high-risk bad debt last week because they knew you were going to default. They thought you were a sinking ship, and they wanted to get off before you hit the bottom. So they sold the note for pennies on the dollar to an anonymous buyer who was willing to take the risk." I locked my eyes onto his, refusing to let him look away. "I am that buyer, Dad. I own the shell company that purchased your debt. I own the $30 million note. I own your personal guarantee. And most importantly, I own the default clause that you signed when you were too arrogant to think you could ever lose." He stared at the documents in the binder, his hands beginning to shake so violently that he had to grip the edge of the table. The realization washed over him in a slow, agonizing wave of horror. He wasn't sitting across from a little girl he could bully with fake doctors and threats of a locked ward. He was sitting across from his sole creditor. He was sitting across from the woman who held his entire life, his reputation, and his fortune in her hands. "I am calling the loan Arthur." I said each word landing like a hammer blow. "Full repayment, $30 million. Due immediately, not next week, Not tomorrow morning. Right now. Arthur's face darkened from a sickly gray to a deep, dangerous purple. A thick vein began to hammer at his temple, looking as though it might burst at any moment. He shot up from his chair so fast that his knees slammed into the underside of the heavy mahogany table. The silver jumped, the fine china rattled, and his heavy oak chair crashed backward onto the parquet floor with a sound like a gunshot. "This is fraud," he bellowed, spit flying from his mouth, as his composure finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You can't do this to me. I am Arthur Sterling. You think you can walk into my home and steal my company with a few pieces of paper? I'll tear them up. I'll have your lawyers disbarred. I'll burn this whole place down before I let you take a single share." He lunged across the table, his fingers clawing at the leather binder, his eyes wide and bloodshot with a frantic, animalistic rage. Leo sprang up from his chair, the wood screeching against the floor. "Dad, stop it! Just stop!" Leo cried out, trying to grab Arthur's arm. Arthur shoved him away with a brutal, backhanded motion that sent my brother stumbling into the heavy sideboard. A crystal decanter of brandy was knocked over, falling to the floor and exploding into a million glittering shards. "Sit down, you coward, Arthur!" roared at Leo, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. I didn't move an inch. I didn't flinch when his hand came within inches of my face. I didn't even blink as he clawed at the pages of the binder, ready to rip my victory into confetti. I simply picked up my phone from the table. My thumb hovered over a pre-drafted message I had prepared hours ago for my lead counsel. It contained only one word: execute. I watched my father wrestle with the heavy binding, his breathing ragged and wet, his dignity completely gone. He looked like a man fighting a ghost in a dark room. Then I hit send. "Go ahead," I said, my voice slicing through the sound of his heavy panting. "Tear it up, burn the pages. You can even eat the paper if you want to. It won't change anything." Arthur froze the pages of the binder, crumpled in his fists. He looked up at me, his chest heaving under his silk shirt, his eyes searching mine for any sign of a bluff. He found nothing but the cold truth. "It doesn't matter what you do to that binder," I said, locking my phone screen and setting it back down on the linen with a soft thud. "That is a courtesy copy for your records. My legal team has been standing by all evening waiting for my signal. They just electronically filed the confession of judgment with the clerk of the court. I tapped the table once with a polished fingernail. It is public record now, Arthur. The debt has been officially called. The default is registered in the system. The clock didn't just run out, it stopped an hour ago." He let the binder drop from his hands. It hit the table with a heavy final thud. "You can't." He whispered, his voice suddenly small and hollow. "I have assets. I have this house. I have the estate in the Hamptons. I have the art collection. The house and the art will take months to foreclose on." I corrected him, standing up and smoothing out my designer dress as if we were merely discussing the seating arrangements for a gala, not the total collapse of his life's work. "I never wanted your house, Arthur. I wanted speed, and I wanted total control. That is why I personally reviewed every single line of the collateral agreement you signed with Cerberus. To get that $30 million bridge loan, you didn't just pledge your real estate, you pledged your controlling stake in Sterling Financial as the primary security." I stepped around the long table, my heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm across the wood, until I was standing directly in front of him. He smelled like sour Scotch, expensive tobacco, and a deep underlying scent of pure fear. Under Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code, a secured creditor has the legal right to seize voting rights immediately upon a default to protect the value of the asset. I leaned closer, my face only inches from his, until he had no choice but to see his own defeat reflected in my eyes. "I am the creditor, Arthur." I whispered, my voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that felt like a razor against his skin, and I just exercised that right. As of 60 seconds ago, I own your shares. I control the board of directors. I control the Sterling Financial building. I control the bank accounts. I control you. His phone began to buzz in his pocket, a frantic, vibrating sound that felt like a death knell in the silent room. Then my phone buzzed, then Leo's. It was an ugly, synchronized chorus of alerts and notifications, all of them announcing the end of an era. That is probably the board secretary or the lead counsel for the firm, I said, calmly watching the light from his phone screen bleed through the fabric of his trousers. They have all been notified of the change in control. The security team at the office has already been briefed. I held his gaze, refusing to give him the mercy of looking away. Congratulations on your retirement, Arthur. You've just been fired from the company that bears your name. He stared at his phone as if it were written in a language he had never learned. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like gravity itself had stolen it, leaving him looking ancient and fragile. He sagged back into his chair with a sound like air rushing out of a punctured tire. For 24 years, this man had been a giant in my life. He had been the man who controlled the weather in our house, the man whose moods decided whether we would laugh or hide in our rooms. Now he just looked small. He looked like a mean, tired old man who had borrowed too much money to buy affection he had never bothered to earn. He turned his head slowly toward my mother, his eyes pleading. "Constance." He rasped, his voice breaking. Tell her this is insanity. Tell her she can't do this to her own family." My mother didn't move. Normally, she would have jumped in to soften the blow, to soothe his ego, or to explain away his rage as mere stress. Tonight, she wasn't even looking at him. She was looking at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else I hadn't seen in decades. It was awe. You could see the math happening in her head, the realization that the daughter she had pitied and mourned for 5 years had just taken the crown off the king's head without breaking a single sweat. She took a slow sip of her water, her hand steady, and said absolutely nothing. That silence was louder than all of Arthur's screaming. It was the sound of a 30-year loyalty finally shifting its weight. I looked over at Leo. He lifted the glass of wine he hadn't touched all night and took a long, slow drink, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he set the glass down and gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The corner of his mouth twitched in a microscopic but unmistakable salute. "You have exactly 30 days, I said, letting the words settle over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. 30 days to vacate the CEO suite at the Sterling Tower. I have already instructed building security to revoke your master access pass, effective at midnight tonight. Tomorrow morning, you can go into the building with a security escort to collect your personal effects. Photos plants the awards you bought for yourself. Leave the files. Leave the laptop. Leave the keys to the company car on the desk." Arthur made a strangled, gargling sound in the back of his throat. "I built that office with my own hands. I built that firm from nothing. And then you leveraged it to cover your bad bets and your gambling debts." I replied, my voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Now it belongs to me. My audit team will be going through the books starting at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. And Arthur, I want you to listen to me very carefully. If I find $1 single of misappropriated funds, if I find one more bribe paid to a doctor, or one more construction loan used to pay off a personal debt, I won't just fire you." I held the silence like a blade to his throat. "I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law." I didn't call him Dad. I couldn't. That man was gone buried under 5 years of ramen noodles and cold Chicago nights. I picked up my designer purse from the table and stood tall. I expected to feel heavy, as if the enormity of what I had done would crush me. Instead, I felt light. I felt weightless, as if the oxygen had finally returned to the room after 24 years of suffocation. "Eleanor," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Where are you going?" "I am going home, Mother," I said. "I am going home to my husband." I walked out of that dining room, my heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm across the dark parquet floor of the foyer. Behind me, I heard the sound of a chair being violently shoved aside. "You ungrateful witch," Arthur screamed, his voice raw, broken, and desperate. It was the last gasp of a tyrant who had realized he was out of ammunition. "I made you. You are nothing without my name. You'll be back on your knees within a month. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around to give him the satisfaction of seeing my face. I kept walking past the oil paintings of ancestors who would have hated me for what I had done through the museum-quiet foyer and out the heavy oak front doors. The night air hit my face cold, sharp, and smelling of rain. I breathed in a deep, lung-filling breath of air that finally belonged to me. I walked down the stone steps to my waiting car, and I didn't look back once. You don't look back at a burning building once you have finally made it out alive. My penthouse in the city was quiet when I finally walked through the door an hour later. There was no fanfare, no victory music playing, just the soft, low hum of the Chicago traffic below and the warm, comforting smell of garlic basil and red wine drifting from the kitchen. Julian was standing at the stove stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He was wearing an old paint-stained t-shirt and humming off-key to a jazz record spinning on the turntable in the corner. He turned around, a wooden spoon in his hand, and gave me a smile that made the last 5 years of struggle feel like a small price to pay. "Hey," he said warmly, his eyes searching mine. "I made your favorite. Cheap noodles, expensive wine. It's our new tradition." He didn't ask if I had won the battle. He didn't ask what I had destroyed or how many bridges I had burned to the ground. He just offered me dinner and a place to rest. I set my purse down on the counter and crossed the room to him, pressing my face into the crook of his neck. He smelled like sawdust soap and safety. The tension that had been holding my spine upright for the last 4 hours finally snapped. I didn't cry, but I let out a long, shuddering breath that felt like I had been holding it since the day I was born. "It's done," I whispered against his skin. "He's gone, Julian. He can never touch us again." Julian wrapped his strong arms around me and held me steady against him. There was no gloating in his voice, no celebration of our enemy's downfall, just a quiet, grounding presence. "We are free, Eleanor," he said softly, kissing the top of my head. "We are finally free." The sun rose over the Chicago skyline the following Monday morning with a cold, indifferent clarity that seemed to mock the chaos I was about to unleash. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse, adjusting the lapels of a charcoal gray power suit that cost more than the car Julian and I had shared during our first year of marriage. I looked at the woman in the glass. She didn't look like a daughter or a victim. She looked like a general preparing for the final sweep of a long and bloody campaign. My phone sat on the marble vanity, buzzing incessantly with news alerts. The financial world was already reeling from the rumors of a hostile takeover at Sterling Financial. The headlines were speculative and frantic, but none of them knew the true identity of the ghost who had purchased Arthur's debt. I arrived at the Sterling Tower at exactly 7:45 in the morning. The lobby was a vast, echoing chamber of white marble and hushed whispers. As I walked toward the security desk, the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of the city. The security guard, a man named Frank who had worked for my father for 20 years, looked up with his mouth slightly open. He had seen me countless times as a child, a teenager, and eventually as the girl being escorted out of the building 5 years ago. "Miss Sterling." He stammered, his eyes darting to the black security pass in my hand. He had been briefed, but seeing the reality was clearly different. "Good morning, Frank," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I believe my clearance has been updated in the system." He swiped my card and the gate clicked open, with a sound that felt like the unlocking of a cage. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like it lasted a lifetime. When the doors opened, the atmosphere in the executive suite was thick with tension. Employees stood in small clusters near the coffee machines, their voices dropping to nothing as I walked past. I headed straight for the CEO's office, the room that had been the epicenter of my father's power for 3 decades. Outside the double oak doors, his longtime executive assistant, Sarah, was sitting at her desk, her eyes red and puffy. She had been Arthur's most loyal soldier, the one who had shielded him from the consequences of his temper for years. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and resentment. "He is inside," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He refused to leave until you arrived." I pushed the doors open without knocking. The office was dim, the only light coming from the gray morning sky through the windows. Arthur was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, but he wasn't working. He was surrounded by cardboard boxes. The shelves that had once been filled with leather-bound books and prestigious awards were mostly empty. He looked smaller than he had at the dinner table. The suit he was wearing seemed to hang off his frame, and the shadows under his eyes were deep and dark. He didn't look up when I entered. He was staring at a framed photograph of our family from 15 years ago, a photo of a time before the ego and the greed had completely consumed him. "I told you to leave the files, Arthur," I said, walking to the center of the room. My voice was devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to the heavy silence of the office. He finally looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the old fire in his eyes, but it died out almost instantly. "I was just looking at this," he said, his voice raspy and thin. "You were such a bright little girl, Eleanor. You had so much potential. I did everything I did to make sure you were strong enough for this world. You should be thanking me. You wouldn't be standing here today if I hadn't pushed you." I walked to the desk and leaned over it, pressing my palms against the cold wood. "You didn't push me, Arthur. You tried to drown me. There's a very big difference between a teacher and a tyrant. You don't get to take credit for the strength I had to build just to survive you. Now get up. My audit team is in the lobby and they are coming up with the board of directors in 10 minutes. I want you out of this chair before they walk through that door." He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. "You are really going to do this? You're going to humiliate your own father in front of the men I've worked with for 30 years. You humiliated yourself when you gambled away the retirement funds of your employees to cover your bad tech bets," I replied. My voice was a low, dangerous hum. "Oh yes, I found it, Arthur. My lawyer spent all weekend digging through the shell company's ledgers. You didn't just lose your own money. You moved nearly $4 million out of the Sterling Foundation, the money meant for underprivileged scholarships, just to keep your head above water for another month. That isn't just a business failure, that is a felony." He went silent, his mouth twitching as he realized the extent of what I knew. "I could have you arrested right now," I continued, "but I promised my mother I wouldn't let the police drag you out of here in handcuffs as long as you left quietly. Don't make me break that promise." Arthur stood up slowly, his movements stiff and awkward. He grabbed his coat from the rack and looked around the office one last time, a man seeing his kingdom for what it truly was, a collection of stolen moments and borrowed time. He walked toward the door, but paused when he was level with me. "You think you've won," he whispered, leaning in so only I could hear him. "But power is a heavy crown, Eleanor. It will change you. In 5 years, you'll be sitting in that chair, looking at someone you love and wondering how much they are worth to you. You're a Sterling, after all. It's in your blood." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I simply watched as he walked out of the office, his head bowed, passing Sarah without a word and disappearing into the elevator. 10 minutes later, the double doors opened again, and the 12 members of the board of directors filed into the room. These were men who had spent their entire careers nodding in agreement with my father, men who had ignored the warning signs because the profits were high enough to keep them comfortable. They looked at me with a mixture of apprehension and forced respect. I didn't sit in the CEO's chair immediately. I stood at the head of the long conference table, my eyes scanning each of them until they felt the weight of the new reality. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "As of this morning, the voting rights for the controlling stake of Sterling Financial have been officially transferred to me. I am aware that many of you have questions about the future of this firm and the legality of this transition. My legal team has provided a full briefing package for each of you. I suggest you read it carefully. We are facing a $30 million debt obligation and a potential investigation into misappropriated funds from the Sterling Foundation. One of the older directors, a man named Henderson, who had been my father's golf partner for years, cleared his throat. Now see here, Eleanor. he said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "This is all very sudden. Your father had a plan to rectify the tech acquisition. We were loyal to him. And that loyalty is exactly why the company is on the brink of collapse." I countered, my eyes locking onto his. "You were loyal to a man, not to the company or the shareholders. You watched him pull money from a charitable foundation, and you did nothing. That ends today. I am not here to ask for your permission. I am here to inform you that the board is being restructured. 4 of you will be asked to resign by the end of the business day. The rest of you will undergo a full performance review by an independent firm. We are going to clean this house from the top down." The room erupted into a low murmur of protest, but I didn't back down. I spent the next 3 hours going through the grim reality of the company's books. I showed them the ledgers, the hidden debts, and the trail of bribes Arthur had used to keep his secrets. By the time the meeting ended, the room was silent. The directors walked out one by one, looking like they had seen a ghost. Henderson was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at me. "You really are your father's daughter," he said, his voice a mix of fear and admiration. "You're even colder than he was." I watched him leave, and finally, for the first time, I sat down in the CEO's chair. It was cold and uncomfortable, a stark reminder that this wasn't a prize, it was a responsibility. I spent the afternoon with the audit team digging through the digital archives of the company. Every file we opened revealed another layer of my father's desperation. He'd created a web of lies so complex that it was a miracle the whole thing hadn't collapsed sooner. He'd been blackmailing vendors, squeezing small contractors, and even using company resources to spy on his competitors. As I read through the documents, I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. This was the legacy I had fought so hard to reclaim, a legacy of rot and shadows. But as I sat there, I also saw the potential. Hidden beneath the corruption were good people, engineers, analysts, and managers who truly cared about their work, but had been stifled by Arthur's ego. I called Julian around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I just needed to hear his voice, something to ground me in the reality of the world I had built for myself. "How is it going?" "CEO," he asked, his voice warm and steady. I could hear the sound of his pencil scratching against a blueprint in the background. "It's a mess, Julian," I said, leaning back in the chair and closing my eyes. "It's worse than I thought." He was stealing from the kids' scholarship fund. He was hurting people just because he could. I feel like I need to wash my hands every 10 minutes. Julian went quiet for a moment. "You aren't him, Eleanor. Remember that. You didn't take that company to be a queen. You took it to be a janitor, clean it up, and then build something better." His words stayed with me as I walked back out into the main office area. Sarah was still there, packing her desk into a small box. She looked up at me, her face guarded. "I'm leaving Miss Sterling," she said. "I don't think I can work for you after what you did to him." I nodded slowly. "I understand, Sarah. You were loyal to him, and I respect that. But before you go, I want you to know that I found the records of the bonuses Arthur withheld from you over the last 3 years to pay for his personal travel. You'll find a check for $50,000 in your final severance package. It's not a gift. It's what he owed you." She froze her hand, hovering over a stapler. "He told me the company was in a freeze," she whispered. "I told you, Sarah, he lied to everyone, including the people who loved him most." I stayed in the office until the sun began to set the orange light of the golden hour flooding the room. The city below was starting to glow as millions of lights flickered on. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like I was running. I didn't feel like I was hiding. I stood by the window and looked out at the skyline, realizing that I had finally dismantled the cage. But as I looked down at the street, I saw a familiar black car parked across the street. It was Arthur's personal car, the one he insisted on driving himself. He was just sitting there, staring up at the building he no longer owned. I watched him for a long time, wondering if he was waiting for me to fail or if he was simply mourning the man he used to be. The phone on the desk rang, breaking the silence. It was the security desk downstairs. "Miss Sterling, we have a problem. There is a man here from the state attorney's office. He says he has a warrant for the digital records of the Sterling Foundation." My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew this was coming eventually, but I hadn't expected it on day one. They must have been watching the accounts even before I took over. I realized then that my battle wasn't just with my father. I was now the face of a company under criminal investigation. If I couldn't prove that I was the one who stopped the bleeding, I would be the one going down with the ship. I took a deep breath and smoothed my hair. "Send him up," I told the guard, "and call my lead counsel. Tell him the state is here and tell him to bring the files on the anonymous purchase of the debt. We are going to show them exactly who is responsible for the theft and who is responsible for the recovery." I hung up the phone and walked to the door, opening it wide. The hallway was empty and quiet, the shadows lengthening as the day turned into night. I knew that the next few months would be the hardest of my life. I would be scrutinized by the press, questioned by the law, and hated by the man who had given me life. But as I waited for the elevator doors to open, I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. The elevator pinged, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out holding a leather briefcase and a set of legal documents. "Miss Eleanor Sterling," he asked, his voice neutral and professional. "I am Assistant State Attorney Miller. I believe you know why I am here." I held out my hand and gave him a firm, unwavering grip. "I've been expecting you, Mr. Miller. Why don't we go into my office? We have a lot to discuss, and I think you'll find that I am very interested in seeing justice served." As we walked into the office, I didn't look back at the empty desk or the shadows in the corner. I focused only on the path forward, on the rebuilding of a name that had been dragged through the mud for far too long. The transition was complete. The war for the company was over, but the fight for the truth was only just beginning. Assistant State Attorney Miller sat across from me, his eyes sharp and suspicious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents that felt like they were vibrating with the weight of potential prison sentences. "Miss Sterling," he began, his voice flat and professional, "my office has been tracking the movement of $4 million from the Sterling Foundation for the last 3 months. We have evidence that this money was used to settle personal margin calls for Arthur Sterling. As the new head of this firm, you are currently the person responsible for these records." I looked him dead in the eye and didn't blink. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small encrypted silver thumb drive that Leo had handed me only hours before. "I am not just the person responsible for those records, Mr. Miller," I said, sliding the drive across the mahogany surface. "I am the person who is reporting them. On that drive, you will find a chronological map of every single dollar my father moved out of that foundation. You will also find a series of internal memos where he threatened the previous comptroller to stay silent. I am not my father's accomplice. I am the one who is stopping him." Miller paused, his hand hovering over the drive. "You understand that by turning this over, you are essentially ensuring your father spends the rest of his life in a federal facility." I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of the Sterling name, like a heavy, cold armor. "I understand that I am protecting the 500 employees of this company and the thousands of students who depend on those scholarships. My father made his choice 5 years ago when he decided that ego was more important than integrity. Now he has to live with the consequences of that choice." The next 72 hours were a blur of legal motions, emergency board meetings, and the relentless flash of paparazzi bulbs outside the Sterling Tower. The news of Arthur Sterling's indictment hit the front page of every major newspaper in the country. The Lion of Chicago had finally been caged not by a rival firm or a government sting, but by the daughter he had tried to break. I spent most of those nights in my office working through the mountain of debt and corruption he had left behind. My lead counsel and I worked until our eyes were bloodshot, untangling the web of toxic loans and offshore accounts. We discovered that Arthur hadn't just been stealing from the foundation. He had been skimming from the employee pension fund to pay for his private jet and his collection of vintage sports cars. On Wednesday morning, my mother came to the office. She didn't have an appointment, but Sarah, who had decided to stay on after all, showed her in quietly. My mother looked different. The terror that had clouded her eyes for 30 years had been replaced by a quiet, fragile kind of peace. She sat on the edge of the chair, her hands folded in her lap. He called me from the detention center, she said, her voice a soft whisper. He wanted me to use my personal savings to post his bail. He was screaming, "Eleanor!" He was saying things I had heard him say to you 1,000 times. I looked at her, waiting for the plea for mercy that I was sure was coming. I told him no. She said, her voice gaining a sudden, unexpected strength. I told him that for the first time in 30 years, I was going to listen to my daughter instead of my fear. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. She set it on my desk. "These were your grandmother's," she said. "She was the one who taught me that a woman's worth isn't defined by the man she marries or the father she is born to. I should have given these to you 5 years ago when you left." I opened the box to find a pair of perfect, shimmering pearl earrings. They weren't just jewelry. They were a bridge back to a lineage that predated Arthur's greed. I put them on right then, feeling the cool weight against my skin. "Thank you, Mom," I said, walking around the desk to hug her. It was the first time in years that she didn't feel like she was made of glass. As she left, she paused at the door. "He's going to trial in 6 months, Eleanor. They say he's facing 10 to 15 years. "I know," I replied, "and I'll be the lead witness for the prosecution." She nodded a final, somber acknowledgement of the price of truth, and then she walked out into the bright morning light. 2 months later, the transformation of the company was nearly complete. The Sterling Financial sign had been removed from the top of the building. In its place was the sleek modern logo of Sterling Heights Hospitality and Development. We weren't just a bank anymore. We were a company that built things, hotels, parks, and sustainable housing. I had spent nearly $40 million of my own company's profits to replenish the Sterling Foundation and the employee pension funds. It was a massive financial hit, one that made my investors nervous, but it was the only way to build a foundation that wasn't rotting from the inside out. Julian walked into my office late one Friday afternoon carrying a large roll of blueprints and 2 cups of coffee. He looked around the room, which I had completely redecorated. The heavy mahogany was gone, replaced by light oak and glass. The air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Ready for the final walkthrough, he asked, his grin wide and infectious. We walked down to the lobby together, where a crew of workers was finishing the installation of a massive mural. It was a depiction of the Chicago skyline, but not just the shiny skyscrapers. It showed the neighborhoods, the small brick houses, and the people who made the city move. At the bottom, in small, elegant letters, was our new company motto, "Built on integrity, sustained by community." I stood there for a long time looking at the names of the people we had helped, the employees we had saved, and the future we were creating. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Leo. He was wearing a suit that actually fit him, and he looked 5 years younger. "I just got the word from the district attorney," Leo said, his voice brimming with relief. Arthur accepted a plea deal. 12 years in a minimum security facility with no possibility of parole for at least 8. He's signing the final forfeiture papers for the estate as we speak. I took a deep breath, feeling the last bit of tension leave my shoulders. "Is Mom okay?" I asked. "She's better than okay." Leo laughed. "She's currently in Florida looking at a small beach house and talking about starting a garden." I walked out of the building with Julian, the cool evening air of Chicago hitting my face. We didn't have a driver waiting for us. We walked toward the subway station, blending in with the thousands of other people heading home after a long week of work. I looked up at the Sterling Heights logo glowing against the night sky. It was mine. Not because it was given to me and not because I had stolen it. It was mine because I had earned it through the fire of the last 5 years. As we descended into the station, I felt Julian take my hand. "Ready to go home?" he asked. I smiled, looking at the man who had stayed by my side when I was just a girl with a mattress on the floor and a dream. "I'm already there," I said. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows the collapse of a dynasty, a stillness that settles over the wreckage of a life built on the shifting sands of ego and greed. We are often taught from a very young age that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred pact that requires us to overlook the darkness in those who share our name. We are told that blood is thicker than water, but we rarely stop to consider that blood can also be a poison if the heart that pumps it is filled with nothing but cold ambition. My father believed that power was a weapon to be wielded against those he loved, a tool to ensure that no one ever grew tall enough to stand in his shadow. He thought that by cutting me off and leaving me to starve, he was teaching me a lesson in humility. What he didn't realize was that he was actually giving me the greatest gift a parent can bestow, the knowledge that I could survive without him. When you lose everything, you gain a very specific kind of clarity. You begin to see the difference between what is valuable and what is merely expensive. A $30,000 watch cannot buy back a single minute of lost time, and a $500 million empire is nothing more than a hollow shell if it is built on the suffering of others. I spent 5 years in the cold learning the architecture of my own soul, and I discovered that my foundation was made of something far stronger than my father's gold. I learned that true power doesn't come from how many people you can control, but from how many people you can lift up. My father died a long time ago, long before he ever stepped foot in a prison cell. He died the moment he stopped seeing his children as people and started seeing them as assets to be managed. As you move through your own lives, I want you to remember that you are not responsible for the sins of your fathers or the shadows of your past. You are the architect of your own future, and you have the right to fire anyone from your life who demands your silence as the price of their support. Do not be afraid to walk away from a burning house, even if your name is carved into the front door. The most important thing you will ever build is your own character, and that is a project that requires no one's permission but your own. Integrity is a slow, quiet work, but it is the only thing that will stand the test of time when the empires of the arrogant have crumbled into dust. If this story of justice and reclaiming one's power resonated with you, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to help us share more stories of resilience and truth. I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between your family and your integrity? Your stories of strength are what keep this channel growing. Thank you for watching, and remember, the ladder is yours to hold and the future is yours to build.